Welcome to The Explainer. All right, today we are cracking open the case file on one of history's most baffling figures.
So, we're diving deep into the life of this one guy from the Renaissance. And he is, well, he's a total paradox. A man who stood right at the crossroads of science and magic.
I mean, think about it. On the one hand, you've got this guy who's a trusted advisor to the Queen, a top mathematician, the guy who's basically dreaming up the British Empire. But on the other hand, he's talking to angels, dabbling in alchemy, and even gets accused of being a traitor. So what gives? How can one person be both?
Yep, this is the man himself, John Dee. And for literally centuries, historians have been arguing about who he really was. And look, this isn't just some dusty old debate about one guy. It's a question that forces us to look at a world that was, frankly, a whole lot stranger than ours. All right, so let's get into it. Let's solve this mystery. We're going to play detective here, sifting through the evidence. And our clues? They're not just from Dee's own writings, but from the different historians who've tried to piece his story together.
You see, the big question for historians is this: was his science totally separate from his magic, or were they, two sides of the same coin? Figuring that out tells us so much, not just about Dee, but about the entire Renaissance mindset. Back then, those neat little boxes we have for science and religion and magic, they just didn't exist. Okay, you ready? Let's look at our first clue.
So, our first piece of the puzzle comes from a historian named Glyn Perry, and Perry's take is fascinating. He says, forget the idea of Dee as some weirdo locked away in a tower. Nope. Perry sees him as a serious political player right in the thick of it at the royal court.
And here's the kicker from Perry's point of view. Dee's magic wasn't some embarrassing secret he had to hide. Just the opposite. It was his golden ticket. It was the very thing that gave him access and influence. He didn't succeed despite his occult practices. He succeeded because of them.
And you can see his influence everywhere. I mean, one minute he's using astrology to pick the exact right day for Queen Elizabeth's coronation. The next, he's inventing the term British Empire to get people fired up about colonizing the New World. This was not a weekend hobby, folks. His magic had very real, very high-stakes consequences. It even got him thrown in jail and tried for treason under Queen Mary. So for Perry, the conclusion is clear. In the Tudor court, magic and politics weren't two different things. They were the same thing.
Okay, so that's one version of Dee, the political insider. But there's more to the story. Our second clue comes from historian Deborah Harkness, and she tackles what is maybe the weirdest part of Dee's life, the fact that he spent years, literally years, trying to talk to angels. Now, Harkness says that to get why he was doing this, you have to put yourself in the 16th century mindset. And that mindset was, well, it was pretty anxious. A lot of people genuinely believed the world was about to end. They were living in what felt like the last days.
And this is where it gets really interesting. From Dee's point of view, the world around him, what he called the book of nature, was broken, corrupted. It was like trying to do science with a faulty instruction manual. So what do? Well, if you're John Dee, you try to go straight to the author. His angel conversations weren't him giving up on science. No way. They were a desperate, radical attempt to get pure, perfect, uncorrupted data directly from the divine source.
All right, we've got the political operator and we've got the apocalyptic scientist. Our third and final clue might be the one that pulls it all together. This idea comes from a scholar named Georg Sioni, and it gives us a powerful motive for everything. Sioni zooms in on one single powerful Latin word that he thinks is the master key to understanding John Dee's entire life. That word is exaltation, and it might just explain it all.
So what does it mean? Well, exaltation wasn't just about learning secrets or getting powerful. It was the ultimate ambition of Renaissance magic, the spiritual perfection of humanity. The idea was that you could purify yourself, ascend beyond the grubby material world, and achieve a perfect, almost godlike state of knowledge to basically become one with the mind of God.
And you can see this big ambition in the actual things he made. Take a look. These weren't just spooky props. His Manus Hieroglyphica on the left, he believed that one symbol contained every secret of the cosmos. The Sigillum Dei on the right, that was the tool he used to contact the angels. To Dee, these were basically spiritual technologies, instruments designed for one grand purpose, achieving that state of exaltatio.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got 3 different John Dees on the table, thanks to 3 different historians. We have the political insider, the end-of-the-world philosopher, and the spiritual seeker trying to become like a god. So, which one is the real John Dee?
Well, if you look at it this way, each scholar gives us a crucial piece of the puzzle. Perry tells us how Dee operated, using the occult as a political tool. Harkness explains the context, the when, this apocalyptic moment that made his extreme method seem logical. And Sony gives us the ultimate motivation, the why, this deep spiritual quest that fueled everything he did.
So the answer to the mystery isn't to pick one and say, that's the guy. The real answer is that he was all of them, all at the same time. Think about it. He was a pragmatic statesman who used magic because he was a desperate philosopher who thought the world was ending, and all of that was driven by this grand spiritual quest for perfection. It all fits together. And it's a great reminder that history isn't always about finding one simple answer. Sometimes it's about seeing how all the messy, complicated pieces create the whole picture.
Which leaves us with one last, kind of spooky thought to chew on. If a guy as famous and as well-documented as John Dee can be interpreted in so many different ways, what about us? How are the historians of the future going to make sense of our own complicated lives?
What if you could explain the entire universe with a single symbol? Well, back in the 16th century, the brilliant and, let's be honest, pretty mysterious Elizabethan magus John Dee claimed he'd done exactly that. But here's the twist. What if I told you this master key to reality was almost completely lost to history? That for over 100 years, its true meaning was a secret, whispered only in the shadows of European alchemy.
So this is it, the Manus Hieroglyphica. Dee designed this incredibly elegant glyph to be a kind of cosmic instruction manual. You can see it combines the astrological symbols for the moon, the sun, the elements, and the sign of Aries, which stands for fire. For Dee, this wasn't just some cool drawing. It was a distillation of all of creation, a key that could unlock the deepest secrets of alchemy and, really, the universe itself.
And that, right there, is the central puzzle. I mean, if this was the ultimate code, the Rosetta Stone of reality, why isn't it famous? Was Dee's grand project just an intellectual failure, a forgotten footnote in history? Or was it actually a secret success, its influence deliberately hidden from the public eye?
To figure that out, we've got to dive into how historians have been debating its influence for decades.
Okay, so the modern case for it being a total flop is summed up perfectly by historian Brian Vickers. He called it possibly the most obscure work ever written by an Englishman, and he famously challenged anyone to find even 10 references to it in the entire 17th century. That is a pretty damning critique. So this is our investigation. Was Vickers right? Was the monad just ignored? Or was it something else entirely? A kind of secret code passed between a very specific group of thinkers across Europe, almost like an underground bestseller. Let's follow the evidence and see where it leads. The first clues to the monad's secret life don't pop up with mainstream scholars. Nope. They appear with a radical group of alchemists who saw it for exactly what it was, a key. These were the Paracelsians. They were followers of this revolutionary physician, Paracelsus, and their whole deal was that medicine, alchemy, and spirituality were all deeply connected. Now, the crucial thing here is that they saw the universe as a book written in a divine language of symbols. So you can imagine when John Dee publishes a book explaining a symbol that supposedly unlocks that very language, they were the perfect audience. They got it immediately. A lot of their thinking was heavily influenced by Kabbalah. Now, Kabbalah is a really ancient Jewish mystical tradition about interpreting sacred texts to understand God's plan. Well, these alchemists adapted those ideas. They came to believe the world itself was a text. They saw letters and numbers not just as things on a page, but as the cosmic building blocks of reality. Dee built his monad on this exact principle, claiming his symbol could be mathematically pulled apart and put back together to reveal those very secrets. And now we get to the proof. This is from a work by a super prominent Paracelsian alchemist, Heinrich Kuhnroth. Look closely at the bird's breast. See it? That's Dee's monad. It's right at the heart of the word Azoth, a key alchemical term for the beginning and the end of the great work. And remember, the great work wasn't just about turning lead into gold. That was a metaphor for the spiritual transformation of the alchemist. So for Kuhnroth, the monad was literally at the heart of everything. And this one illustrates just how important the symbol was. Here, in another one of Kuhnroth's amazing engravings, we see an alchemical citadel. You've got 20 fake paths that lead nowhere, but there's only one true gate to enlightenment. And what's sitting right above that one true gate? Yep, John Dee's monad. It is the literal key that separates truth from error. But the monad's influence wasn't just felt by its fans. You know what they say.
Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and criticism is a close second. The fact that people were stealing Dee's symbol and arguing about it proves it was anything but ignored.
The very first adopter, or plagiarist, depending on your point of view, was a guy named Gerard Dorn, a major editor of Paracelsian texts. In 1568, get this, just 4 years after the Monad was published, a version of it shows up right on the title page of his book. The idea was clearly spreading, and it was spreading fast. So how did John Dee feel about this? Well, we know exactly how he felt, because he wrote this furious little note in the margin of his own copy of Dorn's book. He was clearly ticked off that Dorn had used his work without permission, or even a simple, hey, thanks. This wasn't some forgotten text. This was intellectual property worth fighting over. And it wasn't just Dee's contemporaries either. Nearly a century later, in 1653, the hugely famous Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher publishes this massive work on Egypt. And what do you know? He copies Dee's diagrams exactly, rebrands the symbol as the Crux Hermetica, the Hermetic cross, and presents it as ancient wisdom, without ever mentioning John Dee. This just goes to show you the symbol was still so potent that one of Europe's top minds felt he had to steal it. But here's maybe the most telling part. Even Dee's enemies couldn't ignore him. The early chemist Andreas Libavius was a fierce critic of the Paracelsians. He initially just blew off Dee's more spiritual ideas as fooleries. But later, when he was writing about the symbolism of the alchemical egg, he had to admit that Dee's explanation was a miraculous exposition. That's incredibly high praise coming from a sworn opponent. So when you add it all up, a really clear picture starts to emerge. The Monad wasn't a forgotten failure at all. It was leading this vibrant, secret life, getting passed from one thinker to another all across Europe. I mean, this timeline just completely blows that obscure theory out of the water. From its publication in 1564, it's used by Kunrath in 95, adopted by the Rosicrucians in 1616. It even shows up in a French chemical textbook in 1629, where it's defined as the symbol for all the metals together. Then it's stolen by Kircher in 1653 and reappears as the seal of Hermes in 1679. We're talking more than a century of continuous, documented influence. And its adoption by the Rosicrucians is a really big deal. This mysterious, super influential secret society included the Monad in one of their founding manifestos. This took the symbol beyond just a small circle of alchemists and embedded it deep into the DNA of Western esotericism, basically guaranteeing its survival in the occult underground. So the Monad wasn't obscure at all. It was just misunderstood by anyone who wasn't in the know. It functioned exactly as it was intended to, as a secret code. A key passed quietly between alchemists, mystics, and, even plagiarists, all of whom understood its power, even if they didn't always say its creator's name out loud.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other secret symbols are out there, hiding in plain sight in old books and manuscripts? Their complex, hidden meanings just waiting for someone to find the right key.
You know, for anyone who studies the Renaissance, John Dee is a real puzzle. How do you make sense of a man who was both a brilliant, groundbreaking scientist and a deeply committed occultist? It's a question that's not just about him, but about how we even understand a past that played by a totally different set of rules. So let's dive into the scholarship that has tried to piece this incredible figure together from all the competing stories.
And wow, some of those stories have been harsh. For the longest time, history's verdict on Dee was just brutal. He was called a fanatic, a quack, and, as the Biographia Britannica famously put it, a most deluded enthusiast. And this wasn't some fringe opinion. That was pretty much the standard take on him for almost 300 years.
But then you start digging into the actual, documented facts of his life, and a completely different person emerges. On one side, you've got the reputation, the spooky wizard, the conjurer. But on the other side, you have the reality. A trusted advisor to the queen, a brilliant geographer who is shaping the entire age of exploration, and, well, probably the top scientific mind in the whole country. So how do you square those two things? That is the central problem of John Dee.
So, let's start with the case for Dee the scholar. A lot of modern research, especially work that looks into his personal library, argues that if you only see him as a magus, you're totally missing the point. The real John Dee was a practical, hands-on intellectual, a man of immense and incredibly useful learning.
I mean, the sheer scale of his intellect is just staggering. Take a look at his library. At its peak, it had over 4,000 volumes. That's both printed books and manuscripts. It was, by far, the biggest and most important collection in all of England. The scholar Francis Yates put it perfectly. The whole Renaissance is in this library.
And here's where it gets really surprising. When you actually look at what was in that library, it's not just a bunch of dusty old spellbooks. As William Sherman's work has shown, Dee owned books on an incredible range of practical subjects. We're talking cosmetics, the care of dogs, earthquakes, gymnastics, how to build roads, the science of tides. This isn't the library of some guy with his head in the clouds. This is the toolkit of someone trying to understand everything.
And he put that massive toolkit to work. With all this knowledge, Dee basically became a one-man research institute for the English government. Seriously, he was the guy that called for advice on everything, from draining swamps and finding new trade routes, to developing the math and the political arguments needed for a growing empire.
But of course, we can't just talk about the librarian and the scientist, right? We have to get into the other side of Dee, the side that gave him that infamous reputation. Let's pivot to the esoteric dimension, because this is where things get really challenging and, for a lot of people, really fascinating. Right at the heart of his magical work, you find this symbol, the Manus Hieroglyphica. It's a glyph that Dee claimed came to him in a flash of inspiration over just 12 days back in 1564. For him, it wasn't just a cool drawing. He believed it was a kind of key that could unlock an entirely new science and unify all human knowledge. Now, to even start to get what he was trying to do with the monad, you have to understand the world he was operating in. The scholar Stephen Klukas points out that Dee was working within a tradition called arithmology. It's this old Platonic and Pythagorean idea that numbers aren't just for counting things. They are the divine blueprint of reality itself, a secret language that explains the hidden structure of the entire universe. And he brought that same intellectual rigor to even his most famous activity, his conversations with angels. Now, it's super easy to just write this off as pure delusion, but look at how he describes it. He's not just passively listening, he's trying to figure out the mechanism of how it all works. He theorized that the angels were planting ideas directly into a person's imagination. It's actually a surprisingly psychological way of looking at revelation. Okay, so we've got these two John Dees, the practical scholar and the esoteric seer. But here's the absolute key to understanding him. For Dee himself, this was a totally false distinction. His entire life was one single project to bring these two worlds together.
In his worldview, there just wasn't the hard line we draw today between science and religion, or between what's natural and what's supernatural. He saw mathematics as the bridge, the tool that could connect our physical, messy world with the perfect intellectual world of divine ideas.
Think about it this way. For Dee, doing mathematics was a form of prayer. In his famous preface to an English edition of Euclid's work, he wrote that studying numbers allows the mind to ascend and mount up with speculative winges in spirit to behold in the glass of creation the form of forms. It was a mystical journey for him, a way to talk to God.
And this unified vision applied to everything he did. The scholar Håkon Håkansson argues Dee was basically trying to read the Word of God in all things. So for him, charting a new coastline, advising on naval policy, or even coining the term British Empire wasn't just science or politics. It was just another way of revealing God's plan at work in the world. So why should we care about this guy from the 1500s today? Well, if you're a student in any number of different fields, from history to psychology, Dee's big, unified vision of knowledge isn't just some historical curiosity. It's actually a touchstone for some of the foundational ideas in your major. His legacy pops up in some really surprising places. If you're in political science or history, you have to deal with Dee. He literally coined the term British Empire and helped create its naval strategy. For you literature folks, his life story is a major influence on the legend of Faust and the plays of Marlowe. For linguists, his angelic language is this incredible early search for a universal grammar. In religious studies, he's a perfect case study in Christian Neoplatonism. For psychology, he's an early look into visionary states. And of course, for anyone practicing ceremonial magic, his Enochian system is still massively important. Which really leaves us with the big question. Do we look at John Dee as the last gasp of a superstitious medieval world, a man completely out of sync with the scientific revolution that was just around the corner? Or was he something else? A pioneer of a holistic, unified way of knowing, one that brought the spiritual and the material together, that we in our modern specialized world have maybe lost.
You know, when we talk about John Dee, his reputation is, well, it's complicated. It's been all over the map for centuries. But today, we're not just looking at Dee himself. We're zeroing in on a single, incredibly influential book that completely changed the game for how we see him. We're going to break down this pivotal work from the early 20th century that really set the standard for generations. So here it is. This is the book at the center of our story today, Charlotte Fell Smith's 1909 biography of John Dee. And you have to understand, this was a huge deal. It was the first full-length, serious look at his life in almost 300 years. So in this explainer, we're going to deconstruct the arguments inside this book to see exactly how it pulled off one of history's great reputational makeovers. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at just how badly Dee was being misjudged. Then we'll see how Fellsmith makes the case for his genius. We'll dive into how she reinterprets his supernatural work, how that creates this tragic figure, and finally, what the legacy of this single biography really is. Okay, so to really get what Fellsmith was trying to do, you have to understand the mountain she was trying to climb. Back in 1909, the general opinion of John Dee was not good. It was overwhelmingly negative. So her book wasn't just a biography. It was a rescue mission, a full-on revisionist project to restore his name. And boom, right from the get-go, she lays it all out on the table. This quote basically says it all. She's arguing that Dee wasn't just misunderstood, he was actively slandered for centuries. This is her mission statement, loud and clear. And I mean, these weren't just whispers. Look at the kind of language being thrown around. For hundreds of years, he was called a quack, a juggler, a fanatic. His life's work with the angels was just written off as blasphemy and absurdity. This was the wall of negativity Fellsmith was up against. So how do you fight back against centuries of bad press? Well, Fellsmith's strategy was brilliant, really. She decided to change the subject. Instead of getting bogged down in the occult stuff, she put a spotlight on his solid, tangible achievements, his science, his patriotism, things that had been totally ignored. And she came with receipts. She starts building this case for Dee piece by piece. I mean, look at this list. The guy proposed a national library in 1556. He wrote the intro to the first English version of Euclid. He was a master navigator, a map maker, an advisor to England's greatest explorers. She's painting a picture of a patriot, a true Renaissance man. And for her, a title page like this wasn't just decoration. No, this was Exhibit A. This was proof of Dee's brilliant, practical mind and his total dedication to making England a global power. His actual published works became the foundation of our argument. All right, now for the elephant in the room, the angelic conversations with Edward Kelly. This was the part of Dee's life that had ruined his reputation. Fellsmith knew she couldn't ignore it, so she had to find a way to explain it. And her approach here is really clever. She doesn't deny it happened. Instead, she reframes the whole thing. She argues, look, he wasn't a con man or in league with the devil. He was a deeply pious Christian. Maybe a bit deluded, she admits, but he was sincere. He was pursuing this in absolute good faith. And this quote, this is where you can really see the world she was writing in. In the early 1900s, people were fascinated with spiritualism and psychical research. So she connects Dee's work to that. She basically says, hey, what Dee was doing back then, it's kind of like what our psychical scientists are trying to do now. She frames him as being ahead of his time, an early pioneer in trying to contact another dimension.
So when she looked at stuff like this, Kelly's strange visions or these alchemical drawings, she didn't just dismiss it as nonsense. She treated these things as genuine artifacts of a sincere, if very unusual intellectual journey.
So you take all these pieces, the misunderstood genius, the patriot, the sincere spiritualist, and what do you get? Well, Fellsmith pieces them together to create a totally new portrait of John Dee. He's not a villain anymore. He's a tragic, almost romantic hero. You get this whole new narrative. Dee is no longer the scheming charlatan. No, he's this brilliant man who was just too far ahead of his time. He served his queen and country faithfully, poured his heart into his work, and what did he get for it? He was abandoned, left to die poor and forgotten. It's an incredibly powerful and tragic story. And this is kind of her closing statement, this final, desperate letter from Dee to the Queen. She presents this as the ultimate proof. This isn't the letter of a failed con man. It's the heartbreaking plea of a loyal servant, a great mind completely abandoned by the country he worked so hard to build. Okay, so what does all this mean? Why are we still talking about a book from 1909? Well, to get that, we have to see where her work fits into the bigger picture of how scholars have studied John Dee. This timeline really says it all, doesn't it? You can see the clear dividing line. For centuries, Dee is a quack. Then, 1909, Charlotte Fell Smith comes along and completely reframes him as a misunderstood genius. And that single act opened the door for everyone who came after, especially giants like Francis Yates, who could then analyze Dee not as a hero or villain, but as a complex and central figure of his time. So, to wrap it up, is her book perfect by today's standards? Probably not. We might see it as a bit romantic, maybe a little dated, but that doesn't matter. Her biography was the crucial first step. It was the counter-narrative that was desperately needed to pull Dee's reputation out of the mud and allow for the more nuanced studies we have today. And that really leaves us with a big question to chew on, doesn't it? Looking back at a book like this one reminds us that history isn't just a set of facts, it's a story. And the way that story gets told and retold says just as much about us, the storytellers, as it does about the people we're trying to understand. So when you really get down to it, the legacy of John Dee is a fundamental paradox. I mean, who was this guy? Was he a brilliant, pioneering man of science? Or was he a deluded mystic, just chasing fantasies? For centuries, that single question has defined him. And today, we're going to unpack that whole historical debate by diving into a 400-year-old magical mystery that, believe it or not, might finally settle the case. Right, so to get to the heart of this argument, you first have to understand the two faces of John Dee, the two sides of him that historians have had such a hard time reconciling. You've got the scholar and you've got the conjurer. For hundreds of years, this was pretty much the final word. The 18th century Biographia Britannica, I mean, they didn't pull any punches, did they? They basically called him a gullible, egotistical fool. And this wasn't some minority opinion either. This became the standard historical take. He was either a fraud or a total fanatic. And, you can kind of see why people were so confused. His life is a study in complete opposites. On one side, you have this brilliant scholar, a seriously respected mathematician who advised Queen Elizabeth's top navigators. And on the other side, you have the conjurer. The guy who spent years holed up with his medium, Edward Kelly, trying to talk to angels through a crystal ball. So the big question has always been, how on earth do you make those two people the same person? But what if that whole duality, that whole conflict, is just us projecting our own modern ideas onto the past? See, at the beginning of the 20th century, a totally new perspective started to bubble up, one that really challenged those centuries of ridicule. The first major pushback came in 1909 with this biography by Charlotte Fell Smith. Now, you have to remember, at this time, Dee was still widely seen as a charlatan. But Fell Smith did something radical. She wrote the first serious, sympathetic biography of him in centuries. And listen to how bold her claim is here. She's not just saying he was misunderstood. No, she says he was actively slandered by history. In her eyes, he wasn't a fool at all. He was a victim of everyone who came after him. So her core argument really boils down to this. Dee wasn't irrational. He was just operating on a whole other level that people in his own time, and for centuries after, just couldn't get their heads around. She claimed that what looked like magic to them was actually a form of deep, systematic thinking. But, okay, that's a historical argument, right? It's based on interpretation. How could you ever actually prove it? Well, the proof for Fell Smith's theory was out there. It was just hidden for almost another century, locked away inside a very specific and very, very strange book. A book Dee himself believed was the key to unlocking God's secrets. It was called the Book of Soiga, and it was this magical manuscript filled with all sorts of things. But what really mattered, what Dee was totally obsessed with, were these 36 large tables filled with what just looked like a random jumble of letters. Think about this. It's his very first recorded scrying session with Edward Kelly, back in March of 1582. And this is one of the very first questions he asks the angel Uriel. Before almost anything else, he needs to know about this book. Is it special? Is it important? And Kelly, speaking as the angel, gives him the absolute perfect answer. This wasn't just some old book. It was a divine relic given to Adam in the Garden of Eden. For Dee, this was all the confirmation he needed. This was huge. And you can just feel the desperation in this quote. He wasn't just curious. He was completely convinced that if he could just figure out how to read these tables, he'd be reading the universe's source code, the actual language of God.
But here's the kicker. The book itself, the key piece of evidence for understanding Dee's magical mind, got lost. It completely disappears after he dies and becomes this historical mystery for almost 400 years. That is, until 1994, when 2 copies were finally found. So, with the book rediscovered, scholars could, for the first time ever, analyze the very text that seemed to prove Dee was deluded. And this opened the door for a totally new kind of investigation.
Enter Jim Reeds, a modern cryptologist. He looked at these tables and didn't see magic or divine messages. He saw code, a cryptographic problem. So he put all the letters into a computer and approached it like a code breaker, asking one simple question: is there a pattern here?
And what he found was absolutely incredible. The tables weren't random in the slightest. They were constructed using a complex multi-step mathematical algorithm. It worked like this. Each table had a unique 6-letter code word. That word was fed into a formula to create the first row. And then another consistent rule was used to fill out the rest of the grid, column by column. It was entirely systematic.
I mean, look at this. For every single one of the 36 tables, Reeds was able to extract the secret code word that was used to generate it. The word for the Aries table was NISRM. For Taurus, it was ROLER. This was not some mystical vision. It was a repeatable, deterministic, and entirely logical process.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The Book of Soiga, the very text that was supposed to be Exhibit A for Dee's delusion, turned out to be a work of sophisticated mathematical construction. It was created by a mind that thinks in algorithms and codes. In other words, the mind of a mathematician. And this cryptographic discovery just completely reframes the whole historical debate. It gives us this brand new lens to look back through at all those old arguments about science, magic, and belief. And now we can finally see how all the pieces fit together. You had Fellsmith making a historical argument that Dee's magic was a form of rigorous thought. The Book of Soiga was the best evidence against her. But then Jim Reed's modern scientific analysis of that exact same book gives us the hard mathematical proof that her theory was right all along. Dee wasn't deluded. He was searching for the underlying code of the universe, the divine mathematics he believed held reality together. And what this really shows us is that for a mind like Dee's, there just wasn't a hard line between science, math, and communicating with God. He saw the universe as a text written by God in the language of mathematics. Trying to talk to angels wasn't an abandonment of reason. It was just another way to try and decipher that text. So ultimately, the story of John Dee and the Book of Soiga leaves us with a really provocative question. We have this tendency to look back at the past and draw these very neat, rigid lines between science on one side and superstition on the other. But it makes you wonder, what other systems of thought, what other intellectual worlds have we written off as irrational, simply because we haven't yet found the right tools to decode their logic? Welcome back. So we've talked a lot about John Dee, the man, the courtier, the brilliant mathematician. But today, we are going deep, diving into one of his most challenging and honestly most ambitious works, the Monos Hieroglyphica. This was a symbol he believed contained the very blueprint of the cosmos. And that, right there, was the question that drove John Dee. I mean, think about it. Not just to describe the universe, but to distill its entire structure, everything, from the planets in the sky to the elements on Earth, into one single, perfect, universal symbol. Now, for Dee, this wasn't just some intellectual exercise. This was a profoundly spiritual quest. And this is it, the hieroglyphic monad. To some, it's this incredibly elegant synthesis of astronomical and alchemical symbols. But to others, especially his contemporaries and a lot of later critics, it was just the rambling of a deluded mind. So the real question is, what was Dee actually trying to do with this incredibly cryptic design? Okay, so here's how we're going to unpack this thing. First, we'll get into why the monad was so misunderstood for so long. Then, we'll look at the interpretive key that modern scholars think they've found, Kabbalah. From there, we'll see how Dee adapted this into a real Kabbalah of geometry. Then we'll actually deconstruct the symbol to see how it works. And finally, we'll get to his grand design, this idea of a universal key to all knowledge. Right, so first things first. We have to grapple with the historical baggage that comes with this symbol. For centuries, John Dee's reputation was, to put it lightly, pretty tarnished.
His more esoteric work wasn't just misunderstood, it was actively and often viciously slandered. And look, these weren't just fringe opinions. This was the mainstream view for a long time. People dismissed him as a charlatan, a conjurer who was trafficking with dark forces. His incredible intellectual achievements were either ignored completely or, worse, seen as evidence of something sinister. So in that context, the monad wasn't a work of philosophy. It was basically Exhibit A for his madness. Even people who took his work seriously really struggled with it. Take Merritt Casaubon. He actually published these spiritual diaries, and he was convinced Dee was a sincere Christian, but one who had been tragically tricked by evil spirits. So if even his editors couldn't figure out what his project was all about, what hope did anybody else have? The monad just remained a locked box. So how in the world do we finally find a key to this locked box? Well, in recent decades, scholars like Michael T. Walton have proposed a new one. Their argument is that Dee wasn't some deluded mystic at all. He was a systematic thinker, and he was applying a very specific intellectual toolkit, the Renaissance system of Kabbalah. So what exactly is Kabbalah, at least in this context? Well, it's a system of thought that sees creation itself as a symbolic act. The universe wasn't just made with letters and numbers. In a way, it was made from them. They're seen as the intermediaries between the divine world and the created world. And what that means is, if you can understand the rules of the symbols, you can understand the rules of the universe.
Now, Kabbalah wasn't just a vague idea. It came with a precise method for this kind of analysis, based on three main techniques. First, you have Nadarikon, which is all about breaking things down into their smaller constituent parts. Then there's Tivruf, which is about rearranging those parts to create new meanings. And finally, Gematria, where you analyze the numerical value of letters to find hidden relationships. This was the decoder ring Dee was using. But here, and this is so important, this is where Dee makes a really radical leap. See, traditional Kabbalah was based on the Hebrew alphabet. Dee believed its principles were universal, but the medium itself, a specific language, that wasn't. He wanted something way more fundamental. You can see it right here in his dedication of the Manas Hieroglyphica to the Holy Roman Emperor. Dee makes his belief crystal clear. Alphabets hold divine secrets. For him, they aren't just tools for humans to talk to each other. They're reflections of cosmic truth. I mean, God himself is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of the alphabet. And this is the brilliant what-if at the absolute heart of Dee's project. What if you could apply all those interpretive rules of Kabbalah, but not to the letters of a specific language? What if you could apply them to the universal language of mathematics, the line, the circle, and the point? And that is the crucial point. Dee believed he was creating a real Kabbalah, not some system based on what he called the vulgar letters that men write down, but one based on the fundamental building blocks of reality itself. It was a symbolic language that any philosopher, any mathematician, from any nation could understand, simply because it was drawn from the very fabric of creation.
Okay, so let's actually see this method in action. Dee didn't just drop this final symbol on everyone. He meticulously explained in 24 theorems how to build it, and more importantly, how to take it apart. First, he applies that principle of Notakon, decomposition. He shows us that the monad is a composite symbol. It's built from the central point and circle of the sun, the crescent of the moon, the cross that represents the four elements, and those two little semicircles at the bottom, which represent Aries, the zodiacal sign of fire. Every single piece has a distinct cosmic meaning. Next up, he uses Trisarith, permutation. He takes those component parts and starts rearranging them to form new, meaningful symbols. For instance, he shows that if you combine the cross of the elements with half of the symbol for Aries, or fire, you logically derive the traditional astronomical symbol for Saturn. It just appears. And the whole process is completely systematic. He goes on to demonstrate that by taking another component, the circle of the sun, and attaching it to the cross of the elements, you generate the symbol for Venus. It's almost like a grammatical system for symbols. And this just brilliantly illustrates his logic. To create the symbol for Mercury, which is the core of the monad itself, he simply takes the symbol for Venus he just constructed and adds the final piece, the crescent of the moon. And just like that, every major planetary symbol can be generated from the parts contained within his one master symbol.
So why? Why go to all this trouble? This clearly wasn't just some exercise in clever graphic design. For Dee, this logical generative system had a much, much grander purpose. This was all about creating a unified key to understanding, well, everything. His ambition was staggering. He wanted to create what the scholar Michael T. Walton has called a Hermetic Principia Mathematica, basically a unified theory that connected astronomy, alchemy, mathematics, and theology. The thinking was, if the monad contained the building blocks of all other symbols, then by understanding the monad, you could unlock the secrets of the cosmos itself. And this really brings us full circle, back to where we started. For centuries, the common view was that Dee's work was absurd, maybe even blasphemous. But now, by applying this key of Kabbalah, we can see the monad for what it most likely was, a deeply systematic and incredibly ambitious work of Renaissance philosophy, one that was trying to synthesize all knowledge into a single, elegant framework. This contrast really says it all, doesn't it? The world saw an imposturing juggler, a charlatan. But in his own mind, Dee had achieved his life's work. He had distilled the entire universe down to its essential symbolic grammar. He hadn't just drawn a picture. He believed he had written a formula for reality itself. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. Dee's whole quest was to find a universal language beyond human words. It kind of forces us to wonder, if the deepest truths of the cosmos really are written in a language of symbols and geometry and patterns, what fundamental truths, what elegant systems might we still be missing today just because we're not yet fluent in their language? John Dee. For a lot of people, he's a man of two minds. You've got the brilliant scientist on one hand and the mystical alchemist on the other. But what if that whole story is wrong? In this explainer, we are diving deep into a scholarly debate that might just rewrite our entire understanding of one of history's most fascinating figures. Was his life's work a story of a radical break? Or was it one continuous, evolving vision? So for a long, long time, the leading theory put forward by the scholar Nicholas Clay was that Dee's career had this dramatic turning point. The idea is that in 1564, when he published his masterpiece, the Monas Hieroglyphica, he pivoted hard away from practical science and towards a much more spiritual, Neoplatonic quest for divine knowledge. All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dig into this radical disjuncture theory itself. Then we're going to play detective and head into Dee's personal library to find one crucial clue that changes everything. From there, we'll decode what that clue tells us about his alchemy, and finally, we'll put it all together to see a whole new picture of his life's work. So, the conventional wisdom basically draws this hard line in the sand. On one side, you have his early work, stuff from 1558, which is all grounded in math and natural philosophy. And on the other side, you have the Monas Hieroglyphica, which supposedly unleashes this completely different, highly symbolic, speculative, and deeply Kabbalistic approach. And what this framework does is it essentially splits Dee's career clean in two. You have the early Dee, the practical scientist, who's all about optics and astronomy and hard numbers. And then you have the later Dee, the mystic, the magus, whose work becomes this explicitly spiritual journey using a totally different intellectual toolkit. But, what if there was something that just shatters this entire neat and tidy theory? A piece of evidence, written in Dee's own hand, that actually connects these two supposedly separate worlds? Well, that's exactly what we find when we look at a single book from his library. A book that tells a very, very different story. And here it is. This is the title page from Dee's personal copy of an alchemical text called Vorchidumia. And you see his handwriting right there? He got this book on June 18th, 1559. And that date changes everything. It's 5 full years before he supposedly made this big spiritual turn. And judging by the sheer volume of notes, he didn't just read this book, he went to war with it. So the real secret here, it's all in the margins, in what we call marginalia. And you have to understand, for a thinker like Dee, this wasn't just doodling. The margins of a book were an intellectual workshop, a place to argue with the author, to connect ideas, and to forge his own theories. We're literally looking over his shoulder while he thinks. Right, and Dee, he was never a passive reader. There's this great term for him from the scholar William Sherman, an adverse reader. He didn't just absorb information, he actively wrestled with texts to create something new.
And his notes in this book are a masterclass in that kind of aggressive engagement. I mean, his method was unbelievably systematic. He isn't just highlighting a few things. He's writing summaries, he's cross-referencing other books, he's drawing diagrams, he's doing complex math in the margins, and he's even correcting the author's work. This is a full-on intellectual dialogue happening right there on the page. Okay, and this is where things get really, really interesting. Just look at what he's doing here. On the left, you've got these complex Kabbalistic calculations, the exact method that's supposed to differ in his later, spiritual phase. But what's he using it for in 1559? He's using it to analyze the physical, material properties of alchemical ingredients. He's blending the mystical and the material years before he was supposed to.
And he's also zeroing in on these fundamental physical principles. He takes an entire passage and boils it down to one powerful note. Heat is the only effective agent in this world. This idea that heat is the universal engine of change is a central pillar of his work both before and after 1564. It's a perfect thread of continuity.
But honestly, the most compelling evidence, the real bombshell, comes when Dee stops just commenting on the text and starts actively rewriting it to fit his own alchemical theories that were apparently already fully developed. So, the author of this book, Pantheus, he lays out his recipe, right? He says the starting point for the alchemical process, the prima materia, is a mixture of two distinct things, quicksilver and white sand. And this is the smoking gun. You have to see this. With one clean stroke of his pen, Dee just crosses it out. He physically strikes Arena Alba, the white sand, right out of the book. He's not just making a note to himself, he's correcting the printed text. So why? Why do that? Well, because Dee's making a huge statement here. He's bringing the text in line with this core foundational principle of alchemy you find in classic texts like the Turba Philosophorum, that the great work has to begin from one thing, one unified substance. To Dee, Pantheus was just plain wrong. And as if to just hammer the point home, he adds his own little note right there in the margin. One element and one metal. He's not exploring some new idea. He is confidently stating a core principle of his own philosophy, and he's doing it back in 1559. So, look, when you put all of these pieces together, all these clues from Dee's own hand, that whole story of a radical disjuncture it evaporates. Instead of a career split in two, you see one consistent, powerful intellectual thread. I mean, just think about what we saw in those 1559 notes. The key ingredients of his famous 1564 book, they're already there, fully baked. Using Kabbalah for material science, his focus on heat, his absolute belief in starting from one thing. The blueprint for his life's work was already complete. So instead of this sharp, sudden break, what we're actually seeing is a perfectly logical evolution of his ideas. In 1558, he lays out the physics. In 1559, he stress tests and refines his theory against someone else's work. And then, in 1564, he publishes the full, comprehensive system he'd been developing all along. The evidence staring at us from his own library, it points to this powerful, deep continuity in his alchemical thought. Practical, material alchemy wasn't some late-in-life spiritual hobby. It was a central, consistent pillar of his philosophy right from the start. And this isn't just about shuffling some dates around on a timeline. This changes things. Because if Dee's alchemy was always this practical, this grounded in the material world, then what does that tell us about his most famous spiritual quest? It forces us to ask if those legendary conversations with angels were maybe about more than just divine wisdom.
All right, let's talk about John Dee. Now, we think we know the story, right? Queen Elizabeth's go-to philosopher. But when you really dig in, the picture that emerges is, well, it's way more practical and a whole lot different from the myth we've all heard.
I mean, this is the image we all have in our heads, isn't it? Dee the Magus, the philosopher-magician, totally wrapped up in the occult, talking to angels, trying to unlock the secrets of the universe. But you have to ask yourself, is that really the whole story? Or is it just the part that makes for a good movie?
And look, this image is powerful for a reason. It's captivated people for centuries. A lot of that comes down to the work of historian Frances Yates, who is incredibly influential. She's the one who really cemented this idea of Dee as England's great Hermetic philosopher, a guy whose entire life was this big quest for secret spiritual wisdom.
But what if that's only half the story? Modern scholarship, what some call a post-Yatesian account, is really starting to push back on this. The argument is that by focusing so much on D, the magus, we've basically ignored huge, crucial parts of his life's work. You know, the parts that were actually dedicated to solving the very real, very down-to-earth problems facing England at the time.
So this really gets to the heart of the new argument. It's a total reframing of the debate. It's asking us to stop looking at D as the magus and start seeing him as the intelligencer. And that's not just a fancy word swap. It's a huge shift in perspective. We're moving away from the vita contemplativa, the quiet, contemplative life of a scholar, and toward the vita activa, the active life of a public intellectual who's all about serving the state. And this concept, the vita activa, is absolutely the key to understanding the real John Dee. His whole philosophy wasn't just about sitting around and thinking about the universe. No, he was a classic civic humanist. He believed that knowledge was useless unless you applied it. His goal was to actively make his country better.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what about the evidence? Let's dig into it. First up, we've got a project Dee proposed all the way back in 1556, and get this, it was decades before anyone else was even thinking on this kind of scale. So here's the situation in 1556. Dee looks around and sees an absolute national crisis unfolding. The dissolution of the monasteries had basically dynamited England's libraries. He saw what he called the treasure of all antiquity, centuries of priceless books and manuscripts just scattered to the winds, rotting away, or even being used to wrap pies. It was a catastrophe.
But Dee wasn't just some guy wringing his hands. He was a man with a plan. His proposal to Queen Mary was incredibly detailed, super pragmatic. He didn't just complain, he offered a step-by-step solution. He basically said, "Your Majesty, let's appoint a commission, have them search the entire country, borrow and copy every important manuscript they can find, and create a library royal for the good of the entire nation."
And this is where you really see how far ahead of his time he was. This wasn't some occult fantasy, this was practical nation building. To put it in perspective, his plan for a national library comes almost 50 years before the famous Bodleian Library at Oxford was founded, and nearly 2 centuries before the British Museum finally came into being. Just incredible.
All right, so that's the library. Now let's jump forward to 1577. Our second case study really builds on this idea of Dee as a practical planner. He wrote this treatise, and it wasn't some abstract philosophical text. It was a nuts-and-bolts strategic plan for the future of England's security and its economy.
And right at the core of this whole plan was a number, 60. That's what he said England needed. He called for a permanent standing fleet, a petty navy royal, as he put it, of at least 60 major ships, not just for wartime, but a permanent force.
And again, this wasn't just wishful thinking. Dee laid out a super practical 4-step plan. First, you establish the fleet. Okay, how do you pay for it? Step 2, he proposed a national tax to fund it. Smart. Step 3, use this navy to secure the realm, from pirates, from foreign enemies, even from unrest at home. And finally, step 4, this navy would be a huge economic engine, creating jobs, protecting vital industries like fishing, and securing trade routes.
You see what's happening here? The key takeaway is that this has nothing to do with magic or scrying in a crystal ball. This is hard-nosed policy advice. He was tackling the biggest, most urgent problems facing Queen Elizabeth's government. Piracy was rampant, unemployment was a problem, and key industries needed protection. This was his solution.
And here's the mic drop moment from his treatise. He argues that England must become lords of the seas. Why? Because that naval power was the absolute key to unlocking the nation's wealth and security. Think about that for a second. That's an idea that would go on to define the British Empire for the next 300 years.
So let's pull back for a second. When you put these two huge projects side by side, the plan for a national library and the blueprint for a standing navy, a completely different legacy for John Dee snaps into focus. It's a legacy that's not grounded in some mystical, occult world, but in the very practical brick-and-mortar foundations of a modern nation-state.
I mean, it's pretty stunning. His ideas are literally early blueprints for some of Britain's most important institutions. He's effectively acting as a one-man think tank for the Tudor court, using his incredible breadth of knowledge to advise on state policy. His focus wasn't on the heavens, it was on the tangible, political and economic future of his country.
So at the end of the day, what we're left with is a much richer, more complex picture of John Dee, for sure, but it's also a better understanding of his entire era. It reminds us that back then, the lines we draw today just didn't exist. A philosopher wasn't just an academic. He could be a political strategist, an economist, a military planner, and an imperial visionary, all at the same time.
And that's really the big question this leads us with. This reevaluation of Dee is about more than just one guy. It's a challenge to all of us to look past the easy myths and the convenient labels we stick on historical figures. It makes you wonder, right? If we could get someone as famous and as well-documented as John Dee so wrong for so long, who else in history are we looking at but failing to really see?
So, to Queen Elizabeth I, he was a trusted advisor, a brilliant mathematician, and the guy who envisioned a global British empire. But for most of us, when we hear the name John Dee, we think of something else entirely. A magician, a mystic, the arch-conjurer of England. Today, we're going to try and open a door into a forgotten time to find the real John Dee.
Okay, let's just dive right in. When you picture John Dee, this is probably what comes to mind, right? You've got this obsidian mirror for scrying into the future, a crystal ball, these super intricate wax seals, and golden talismans. I mean, this is the whole shebang he used to try and talk to angels. It looks like something straight out of a fantasy movie. But believe me, this is only one tiny piece of a much, much bigger puzzle.
So that leaves us with the big question. What was he? A total fraud, just playing on the superstitions of the time? Was he genuinely unhinged, a madman who really believed he was chatting with spirits? Or was he something else? A genius whose way of seeing the world was just so profoundly different from ours that we've kind of missed the point all this time.
To even start to unpack that, we have to get our heads around the world he was born into. And trust me, it was not the world you might think. It was a place just humming with magical forces, from the highest levels of society all the way down to the ground.
You know, digging into John Dee's life is like opening a door to this. Well, it's almost an alien universe. In 16th century England, those clear lines we have today between, say, science and superstition, or even between a prayer and a magic spell, they were just incredibly blurry. Magic wasn't some fringe thing people dabbled in. It was like the basic operating system of everyday life.
And here's what's so wild. Just look at how normal these practices were. A baby's baptism? That wasn't just a nice little ceremony, it was literally seen as an exorcism to kick the devil out. You'd bring home blessed candles from church, but not just for light. Oh no, they were there to make demons scram during a thunderstorm. Even holy water could be used in spells to see the future. This wasn't considered the dark arts, this was the church-approved, totally normal spiritual tech of the day. This is the air that John Dee grew up breathing.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Here's the twist in the story. See, Dee wasn't some weirdo living on the fringes of society. His training in magic actually began right at the heart of England's most prestigious intellectual establishment, Cambridge University.
And this just lays it out so perfectly. For a guy like Dee, his official formal education and his occult stuff weren't two separate worlds. They were two sides of the very same coin. So when he's studying Aristotle's philosophy on matter, that wasn't just some abstract theory. That was the key to figuring out alchemy and transmutation. Euclidean geometry wasn't just about triangles and squares. It was about measuring the invisible astrological forces that shape everything on Earth. And optics, the study of light, well, that gave him the scientific foundation for how to focus light rays to summon angels into a crystal. To him, this all made perfect sense. It wasn't science or magic, it was all one thing.
And he was super inspired by thinkers like Roger Bacon, a friar from the 13th century. The idea was that, sure, you can learn a lot from books and experiments, but the real deep knowledge, the big secrets of the universe, that had to be received through divine illumination, through a direct revelation. Your brain could only take you so far. To get the ultimate truths, you needed a little help from, let's say, upstairs. So, let's recap. We've got this brilliant guy from a world that is just drenched in magic, and he's got this elite education that completely backs up his mystical worldview. So what's he going to do with it all? He takes it straight to the top. Because for him, his occult knowledge wasn't some dirty little secret, it was his single greatest asset.
And this is the part you really have to get. Dee wasn't some outsider that the royal court just kind of tolerated. He was an insider because of his occult philosophy. The most powerful people in England weren't scared of these ideas, they were fascinated. They were all in. They actively sought him out for his expertise.
And look, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at these two famous portraits of Queen Elizabeth herself. On the left, she's wearing a jewel shaped like a phoenix, a huge alchemical symbol for the Philosopher's Stone. And on the right, a pelican jewel, which represents a special kind of alchemical container. These weren't just fancy brooches, you guys. They were a statement.
The queen herself spent hours reading alchemical texts, looking for that one thing that could purify everything. Okay, now let me introduce you to this guy, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. He was the Queen's chief minister, her most powerful advisor, a man famous for being super serious, super practical. I mean, come on, look at him. He is the last person on Earth you would think would be into magic. And this is incredible. Underneath that stuffy, serious exterior was a man who's literally begging alchemists for a piece of the philosopher's stone. Why? To help fund the Navy against the Spanish Armada. The most powerful, straight-laced politician in the country was a believer. This wasn't some fringe hobby. At the Elizabethan court, this was the culture.
So to bring this all home, there's this one story, a true story, that is just the perfect metaphor for Dee's entire life and for this whole hidden history he represents.
So, picture this. It's 1642, and a couple buys this beautiful cedar chest that, turns out, used to belong to John Dee. For 20 years, it's just a piece of furniture in their house. Nothing special. Then one day, they go to move it, and they hear something rattling around inside. They search all over, find this tiny little crack, push it, and crick! A secret compartment slides open. And inside, they find these mysterious books and a hidden Catholic rosary. You see? That chest, that's John Dee in a nutshell. On the outside, it looks like one thing, a normal, respectable piece of furniture. But inside, there's a secret hidden world. And it's also a metaphor for that whole era. We look back at the Elizabethan age, and we think we know what it was all about. But if you know just where to press, a secret compartment slides open, and it reveals this strange, unfamiliar place where magic, religion, science, and politics were all hopelessly tangled together. And that kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? If a guy as important as John Dee, in an era as famous as the Elizabethan age, can have this whole secret dimension that we've mostly forgotten about, what other secrets, what other hidden compartments are still just sitting there in our own history, hiding in plain sight?
So if you know anything about John Dee, the story you usually get is one of a total contradiction, right? You've got the brilliant scientist on one hand, and then the deluded occultist on the other. But what if that whole narrative is just fundamentally wrong? We're about to unpack a really powerful academic argument that completely reframes Dee's entire life, not as a contradiction, but as one single unified quest. And our guide for this deep dive is historian Håkon Håkansson's incredible 2001 work, Seeing the Word. It's from this text that we're going to draw a brand new and honestly a much more unified perspective on what Dee was actually trying to do his whole life. Okay, so here's the game plan. We'll kick things off with Håkansson's main argument, his central thesis. Then we're going to define a key concept he uses, something called symbolic exegesis. After that, we'll dig into its philosophical roots, see how it applies to Dee's magic, and finally piece together the brand new, cohesive picture of Dee that comes out of all this. So what is Håkansson's big idea? Well, it starts by basically throwing out all the old, tired debates. And here's the real kicker. Instead of seeing this split personality, the rational scientist who kind of goes off the deep end into mysticism, Håkansson says we need to see Dee's career as a single, consistent, lifelong project. From his early mathematical work all the way to his famous angelic conversations, it was all part of one grand, unified mission. So, what was that mission and what was the glue that held it all together? Well, the answer, according to Håkansson, lies in this one absolutely central concept that was at the very heart of Dee's worldview: symbolic exegesis. So what is symbolic exegesis? At its core, you can think of it as a method of interpretation. But it's built on this profound belief that language isn't just for talking to each other. No, for Dee, language was the key to unlocking reality itself. It was the tool you used to read and understand the entire natural world. You see, for Dee and a lot of Renaissance thinkers, God was seen as the author of two massive foundational texts. First, you had Scripture, the revealed word. But the second was the book of nature, the world itself. And symbolic exegesis was the intellectual technology, the operating system, designed to read both of them, to find the divine wisdom that was literally encoded into creation. And this really breaks down how it all fits together. You see, everything flows from the top, from the verbum Dei, the creative word of God. This word then shows up in two places, as the physical book of nature and as the languages of man. The core idea here was that human language, at least in its purest form, was a direct reflection of that divine creative power.
The whole project was about finding and restoring those connections. Okay, so to really get this, we have to dive into the rich philosophical and, historical worldview that was driving Dee's entire mission. It all hinges on this ancient concept of logos, which Håkansson explains had this threefold meaning. First, it was divine reason. Think of it as the blueprint in God's mind. Second, it was the word, the actual expression of that reason in the world around us. And finally, number three, it was human speech, which was seen as a potential mirror, a reflection of that divine reason. You can see just how deeply connected language, humanity, and the divine were believed to be. And this whole philosophy was wrapped up in a really powerful story about history itself. The idea was that, in the very beginning, Adam spoke a perfect language. It didn't just describe things, it captured their true essence. But then came the fall, and then the Tower of Babel, and human language became this fractured, distorted mess, just an echo of the original truth. So the great quest for scholars like Dee was an act of restoration, to get back that pure Adamic language, and with it, Adam's perfect knowledge. You might be wondering, okay, but how could one person study Jewish Kabbalah, pagan texts, and Christian mysticism all at the same time? Well, the answer was the Philosophia Perennis, or perennial philosophy. This was the belief that a single universal truth was given to humanity way back in antiquity, and that you could find little fragments of it hidden in all these different ancient traditions. For Dee, this was huge. It meant that Kabbalah, alchemy, and magic weren't really separate fields. They were just different dialects of the same hidden divine language. All right, so now we can start to see how all the pieces click into place. With this framework, these most famous and, let's be honest, most controversial works stop looking like these bizarre digressions. They actually become practical, logical applications of symbolic exegesis. Let's take his Monas Hieroglyphica from 1564. Now, this wasn't just some mystical doodle. For Dee, this was huge. He presented this symbol as a kind of meta-language. He genuinely believed that this one geometric figure held the secrets of creation and could be used to unify all the sciences, astronomy, alchemy, you name it, into a single body of knowledge. It was really his first major crack at building a tool for symbolic exegesis. And this is where Håkansson's argument really shines. It's fascinating. On the left, you've got the Monas, a symbol he constructed himself to try and interpret the Book of Nature. Fast forward about 20 years, and on the right, he's doing the angelic conversations, a direct attempt to just bypass human error and learn the divine language straight from the source. Håkansson's key insight here is that this isn't a break in thought, it's just a shift in strategy, from philosophical to prophetic, to get to the exact same goal, accessing the Word of God. And this quote from Håkansson himself just nails it. He says Dee's career was a continuous striving toward a complete restoration of the wisdom of the ancients, which ultimately would lead him to the very origin of truth, the Word. It wasn't a journey from science to magic. It was a single, unbroken quest for the total restoration of knowledge, a journey back to the source code of reality itself. Okay, so let's pull all of this together. What's the big takeaway from looking at John Dee through Håkansson's eyes? What does this all mean for how we understand him? What Håkansson's work does, really, is it gives us a much cleaner, more intellectually satisfying picture. That old conflict between magus and scientist, it just dissolves. It's replaced by the image of a consistent, unified project. We see a scholar whose philosophy didn't really change, but whose methods evolved as he relentlessly pursued a single goal, a goal that was totally rooted in the power of language. So in the end, Håkansson is really just giving us a new lens to look through, and when you look at these career through it, all the scattered and contradictory pieces, the math, the alchemy, the angel conversations, even his politics, they suddenly snap into one single, sharp and focused image of a man on an incredible, lifelong quest. And this reframing of Dee leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? Håkansson's work doesn't just help us understand some guy from the 16th century, it forces us to confront Dee's core belief, that language isn't just a tool we use to describe reality, but is actually woven into its very fabric. In a world now literally built on code, on algorithms, on information theory, you kind of have to wonder, what if he was right? So today, we're going to dive into the really strange and fascinating world of a man named John Dee. Now, this guy was one of the greatest minds of the Elizabethan age, a total genius, a man of science, and even a trusted advisor to the Queen. But he had this secret project, one that took up years of his life. And trust me, it's probably not what you're thinking. I mean, just look at his resume. John Dee was the real deal. He was a Cambridge-educated natural philosopher, a brilliant mathematician, and an incredible astronomer. He was so well respected that Queen Elizabeth I herself actually relied on him for advice. So let's be clear, this wasn't some fringe character. This guy was a pillar of the English intellectual world. But here's the thing. For all the work he did in public, for science and for the Queen, his most demanding project, the one that really consumed him, that all happened in private. It was a secret obsession that has kept historians scratching their heads for centuries. Yup, you heard that right. The Queen's top philosopher spent years of his life trying to talk to angels. And he wasn't just, praying or meditating. He was running systematic experiments to try and communicate directly with divine beings. So you have to ask, right? How could a man of such incredible intellect and reason dedicate his entire life to something that, at least to us today, sounds like pure fantasy? Was he a genius who was pushing the absolute limits of knowledge? Or had he, just lost his mind? Well, to even begin to understand John Dee, first you've got to understand the world he was living in. And believe me, the late 16th century was a pretty terrifying time to be alive. As the historian Deborah Harkness puts it, the whole era was just defined by chaos. It was like a pressure cooker of anxiety. People genuinely felt like history itself was speeding up, heading towards some huge, dramatic conclusion. And it's honestly hard for us to imagine the weight of all this anxiety. You had the Protestant Reformation tearing Europe apart. You had apocalyptic prophecies popping up everywhere. And political paranoia was just rampant. For Dee and pretty much everyone around him, the end of the world wasn't some metaphor. It was a real, tangible event they expected to see in their own lifetimes. And this feeling of crisis, it wasn't just in politics and religion. It bled right into science itself. Dee was up against a really fundamental problem with the very source of all his knowledge. So, to get what Dee was struggling with, you have to know about this idea called the Book of Nature. Think of it this way. People at the time believed God had written two books for us. First, there's the book of Scripture, that's the Bible. But then there was the book of nature, the physical world all around us. The idea was that by studying nature, you could actually read God's other great work. But here's the catch. While the Bible was seen as this perfect, unchanging text, the book of nature, well, it seemed broken. To people in the 16th century, it felt like the world was literally decaying, just falling apart. You had massive storms, terrible plagues, reports of monstrous births, and all of these were seen as signs that nature, God's second book, was corrupted and basically unreadable. And for a natural philosopher, a scientist like Dee, this was an absolute catastrophe. How are you supposed to do science when your main source material, the natural world itself, is so corrupted that it just doesn't make sense anymore? All the traditional tools, philosophy and observation, they just weren't cutting it. So, faced with a world that seemed broken and with tools that weren't working, Dee didn't just give up. Nope. Instead, he made a totally radical move and went searching for a completely new kind of instrument. He basically came to the conclusion that if humans couldn't read the book of nature anymore, then he needed to go straight to the author. He needed a direct line. And, well, that meant talking to God's messengers, the angels. Now, this was not some vague, mystical hope. It was a structured, almost scientific project. Dee hired assistants called scryers, the most famous being the controversial Edward Kelly, and they would stare into a crystal showstone and report back what they saw and heard. And Dee, being the scholar he was, wrote everything down, meticulously. We're talking complex diagrams, a whole angelic alphabet, all recorded in what we now call his angel diaries. So what was the point of all this? The angels weren't there for telling fortunes. For Dee, they were supposed to be a new kind of scientific instrument. The idea was that they would reveal the original language of creation, this kind of divine code, which would give Dee the tools to finally fix, to restore, and to read the corrupted book of nature correctly. It was basically an attempt to get the universe's original instruction manual, straight from the source. But this quest for answers came at a huge personal cost. Let's take a snapshot of his life in 1586. Dee is in Prague, and the pressure is just immense. His patron, the Holy Roman Emperor, is getting impatient. The Pope has launched an investigation into his prophecies. His scryer, Kelly, is becoming more and more erratic and demanding. And his poor wife, Jane, is just sick and tired of being dragged all over Europe. This was not some quiet, scholarly pursuit. It was a high-stakes, incredibly stressful, and very, very human journey. So let's circle back to our original question. Now that we have all this context, how should we really think about John Dee and his conversations with angels? What was he? A scientist? A magician? A prophet? Or a fool? Well, the truth is, he might have been a little bit of all of them, which is exactly why the answer isn't so simple. Probably the best way to understand Dee is to see him as a liminal figure, which is just a fancy way of saying he was a man standing on the threshold between two different worlds. He had one foot in the medieval worldview of magic and spirits, and his other foot was stepping into the brand new modern world of experimental science. He was just caught right in between all these shifting ideas. And here's what that all means. Dee wasn't abandoning reason. From his point of view, in a world that he truly believed was ending, a world whose rules were becoming unreadable, turning to angels wasn't an act of madness. It was a logical, pretty extraordinary next step in his lifelong search for knowledge. And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? John Dee's story is way more than just a weird historical curiosity. It forces us to ask a question that's absolutely timeless. When our own world feels chaotic and the old ways of understanding it just don't seem to work anymore, where do we turn for answers? And maybe more importantly, how far are we willing to go to find them? All right, today we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating and honestly weirdest figures of the Renaissance, John Dee. Here's a guy who was a brilliant mathematician, a trusted advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and a man who was absolutely convinced he was talking to angels. So how on earth could one of the greatest minds of his era also believe he was getting messages from the divine? Well, let's get into it. So what you're looking at here is the front page of Dee's most famous mystical work, the Manis Hieroglyphica. And really, it's the perfect symbol for the man himself. He was a respected scientist, an advisor to the queen, but he was also, a practicing magician. I mean, how do you even begin to wrap your head around a guy like that? And that right there, that's the central puzzle of John Dee. He's a true Renaissance paradox. He was living at the crossroads of two worlds that, at least to us, seem like they should be on opposite sides of the universe. Okay, so on one side of the coin, you have Dee the scientist. This was a celebrated mathematician, a brilliant cartographer who literally helped England expand its empire. The guy had one of the biggest libraries in all of Europe. But then on the other side, you have Dee the magician, an alchemist trying to unlock the secrets of matter, and a mystic who spent years, and I mean years, having what he called angelic conversations to get knowledge straight from God. So yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Was he a certified genius or just a brilliant man who went off the deep end? To even get close to an answer, we have to do something kind of tricky. We have to completely ditch our 21st century mindset and try to see the universe the way he did. See, to get Dee, you first have to get his world. And believe me, his universe was fundamentally different from the one we think we live in today. We look up at the stars and we think of physics, right? A giant clockwork machine governed by cold, hard laws. But for Dee and everyone back then, nope, the universe was alive. It was seen as this single, massive organism, and everything in it was connected by a universal spirit, what they called the Spiritus Mundi. A perfect picture of this is the Great Chain of Being. Think of it like a giant cosmic ladder. At the very top, you've got God. Then come the angels, then us humans, then animals, plants, and way down at the bottom, rocks and minerals. Everything had its proper place, all part of this one single divine system. And here's the kicker. Because it was all one big living thing, every single rung on that ladder was connected to every other one. The way the planets moved could actually influence the metals deep in the earth. The stars in the sky could affect your health. To them, this wasn't superstition. This was just nature. These were the hidden laws of the universe. This diagram really breaks it down. On the right, that's the macrocosm, the big universe. And on the left, that's the microcosm. That's you, that's me. All those lines show how everything mirrors each other, because in their worldview, a person was basically a miniature version of the entire cosmos. This idea gets summed up perfectly in this ancient alchemical text. You've probably heard the phrase, as above, so below. It meant that if you could understand the heavens, you could understand yourself. And even better, if you could manipulate something small down here on Earth, you could cause a change way up there in the cosmos. That was the basic logic behind all of magic. And, wow, just take a look at this. This is that worldview in all its glory. This is Robert Flood's vision of the cosmos. See that triangle of pure spirit coming down from God at the top? And see the pyramid of physical matter rising up from the earth to meet it? The universe wasn't just sitting there. It was this beautiful, living, breathing dance between the spiritual and the material. Okay, so mapping out this whole connected universe, this wasn't just, for fun or for some intellectual puzzle. It had a much, much bigger purpose. For Renaissance thinkers like John Dee, knowing all this was the key to a quest for becoming like God. Think about it from their theological point of view. Before the fall, in the Garden of Eden, Adam was basically perfect, right? He had perfect knowledge. He was given dominion over all the earth. The whole point of magic for these guys was to get that back, to repair humanity and restore that lost godlike power. And this incredible ambition, it actually had a name, Exaltatu. It was this powerful belief that through sacred knowledge, through mystical practices, you could literally elevate yourself. You could climb back up that great chain of being and reunite with the divine. I love how the philosopher Pico della Mirandola put it. I mean, listen to that. It wasn't about parlor tricks or illusions. It was about achieving a kind of spiritual perfection, a kind of omniscience, while you were still alive right here on Earth. And this is the key. This quest for exaltation is where John Dee's whole life suddenly clicks into place. What looks to us like a messy contradiction between science and magic was, for him, one single, unified project, and the goal was achieving that divine state. So let's break it down. Look at all the different things Dee was doing. His astrology wasn't just about telling fortunes. It was about understanding the cosmic forces flowing down from the heavens. His alchemy was about purifying physical matter, which was a metaphor for purifying the human soul. And his angel magic, well, that was the ultimate shortcut, a direct line to get knowledge straight from the source. It all fit together perfectly. So when Dee looked at this symbol, the Manus Rillenius, he wasn't just seeing some cool logo. For him, this was a powerful sign, a single symbol that he believed held all the secrets of the universe in one image. It blended the signs for the sun, the moon, the elements, everything into one. To understand this symbol was to understand how God put the universe together. So what does this all mean when we look back at a figure like John Dee? Well, what we're really seeing is a ghost of a completely different way of seeing the world. A time before we built this massive wall between what we call science and what we call spirituality. For us, it's simple. Science is over here, magic and belief are way over there. Two totally different things. But for Dee, no way. Mathematics was a tool to understand the divine architecture of the cosmos, and talking to an angel was a way to discover a fundamental truth about nature. They were just two different methods for reaching the exact same goal, truth with a capital T. And this is maybe the most important thing to get about him. Dee never thought he was giving up on science to do magic. In his mind, he was upgrading. His angelic conversations were a way to bypass the flawed, broken science of fallen humanity and get direct access to what he called the radical truths, that perfect original wisdom that was lost back in the Garden of Eden. Which leaves us with one last, kind of mind-bending thought. John Dee's story isn't just about some strange, long-dead historical figure. It's a real reminder that the way we see the world today isn't the only way there is. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If the great quest for knowledge once included both the physical world and the mystical one, what did we forget when we decided to only walk down one path?